Okay, so welcome to everyone today. I'm very happy to see you all here. And this is our 15th meeting. I can hardly believe 15 meetings since the middle of 2003. We've been having these meetings. And our focus today is going to be morphosyntax in child-directed language. Okay, so this is the box of things that we suggest that you look at in morphosyntax in child-directed language. The first question is, do you observe any differences in the mean length of utterance? And if yes, in what way? The second question, do you observe any morphosyntactic differences to adult-directed language? And if yes, which ones? And the third question, do you observe any repetitions and variations? And if yes, which types? So variation sets, formulaic utterances, etc. And then if you want to expand on that, we have a couple of questions that expand on the repetition and variation. So I'm going to go through each of these questions and talk about what we did for the Inuktitut sketch. So all my examples today are going to be from Inuktitut. They're sort of labeled down in the corner, but I'm just saying straight out, they're all going to be from Inuktitut. And don't hesitate to jump in and ask questions if you want to. Okay, so the first question of focus is the mean length of utterance. And here we have some phrasing in the text of the sketch acquisition manual, but largely it says, are there differences in the length of utterance addressed to younger versus older children? And so as we specify there, and there's lots of articles on this, you can measure mean length of utterance by morpheme or by word or by syllable, whatever makes sense for your language. For Inuktitut, we measured it by morpheme. And so here we see the 5 ages. So typically for this sketch, we recommend that you collect data at age 2 years, 2.5, 3, 3.5, and 4. But for Inuktitut, because we already had the data before the sketch project began, we have data from 1.4, 1.10, 2.4, 2.10, and 3.4. And then we have 2 children for each age. They're mostly different children at each age. So I think there's a total of 7 children represented among these 10 data points. And so this mother A and mother B are not the same mother at each point. They're whatever mother it is. There's 2 mothers. And we see the means for the MLU at each of the ages. And so what I want you to notice here is that at 1 year, 4 months, we see that the mothers in their child-directed speech have an average of 2.43 morphemes, and at 3 years, 4 months, an average of 4.4 morphemes, and it increases gradually across time. So at least in Inuktitut then, they have words addressed to younger children are shorter than words addressed to older children. Okay, then we also looked at, sorry, that was here, utterances addressed to younger children are shorter than utterances addressed to older children. Okay, then we also looked at words. So Inuktitut, as you probably know, is an agglutinative and polysynthetic language, and so there's lots of morphology happening within the words. And words tend to be quite long, and so we decided to measure the word length as well as a measure of whether whether mothers were using longer utterances in their speech. And so what you see here is now the 5 age groups down the first column here. And across the top, we see the number of morphemes per word. So words of 1 morpheme, 2, 3, etc., up to 7 morphemes. And what we can see here, if we compare the top lines and bottom lines, is that in the for the mothers speaking to kids at age 1 year, 4 months, about 74% of their words have 1 or 2 morphemes, whereas for mothers speaking to children at 3 years, 4 months, only about 50% of their words have one or two morphemes, and the other 50% have three or more morphemes, whereas the three or more morphemes for the youngest age group is only 26%. Another thing to notice is, of course, that at every age group, the one morpheme word is the most frequent. It's 42% at the youngest age and 30% at the oldest age, but still the most frequent across all the ages. So it's not that having a one morpheme word is only for baby talk or whatever. It's frequent, also not that infrequent in adult-directed speech. And also, even at 1 year, 4 months, kids are hearing words that have as many as 6 morphemes. And by 1 year, 10 months, we see examples of 7 morphemes in the word. So it's not that young children are never hearing longer, more complex words, but the distribution seems to change gradually as kids get older. So that was also very interesting to see for us. And here are some examples of typical child-directed utterances at younger versus older ages. So here we see at the youngest age, 2 morpheme utterances. Both of these have verb root and then a verbal inflection, and they both have imperative inflections, which is the type of inflection that's really predominant at the youngest ages. Not surprising, because the parents are telling the kids to do stuff. And then at the oldest stage that we have in the data, we see longer utterances. So here, this first utterance, Ani Tautzawavit, you might get hurt, has 4 morphemes in it. It has a passive morpheme, and it also has a contingent inflection, which is one of the later acquired inflections for children and also appears a little bit later in child-directed utterances. And the second utterance here, Hausialonik atuhatakit, did you wear your wet boots, has 2 words. It's an object and then the verb. The verb, like in the earlier utterances, has a verb root and an inflection, but also an aspect marker. And the noun has a dual marker on it, a dual case marker, which is also relatively rarer. And so these things start appearing more in slightly older children. Okay. So that is what I wanted to say then about child-directed utterances and their mean length of utterance, that both in terms of words and in terms of utterances, both are longer to older kids than to younger kids. Okay, so then the next question we come to in the Sketch Acquisition Manual has to do with morphosyntactic differences. Are child-directed utterances essentially correct and complete? And do you observe ungrammatical structures or simplifications or omissions? So we looked at this in Inuktitut as well and found that essentially child-directed utterances in Inuktitut were correct and complete. So we found that 96% of verbs have inflections. The Inuktitut verbal inflectional system is fairly complex. There's almost 100 different inflections possible. And so we thought, well, one possibility is caregivers would just leave off the inflections, but that is not the case. They use them all the time, even at the very youngest ages. We found, as we saw in the last few slides, that utterances are indeed simpler and shorter, but they're not ungrammatical. So it's not that required morphemes are removed or required words are removed or whatever. They're just shorter. Okay, so that was not so interesting. So yes, Sigal?
May I make a comment?
Of course.
In Hebrew, it doesn't necessarily have to be so, because as children grow older or as language develops, inflection takes over overt pronouns, for instance. So you have the person number incorporated into a prefix or suffix. So I think when we talk to older children, they may use is more a, synthetic morphology
Mhm.
than the analytic forms. So
So in Hebrew, you
so
find at the beginning they have more like this separate subject and object, but not the inflection on the verb, and then yes.
So I'm just saying that it doesn't have to be that when children grow older, CDS, when measured in MLU, is the values of CDS spoken to children who are older doesn't have to be higher than the MLU scores for CDS spoken to
Mhm.
younger children directly.
Yeah. That makes sense.
Because of these, morphosyntactic properties.
Right. Yeah. So that totally makes sense, and that's
That's the point.
something we need to stress throughout is that depending on the typology of the language, of course, we're going to get different kinds of answers to these questions. And what is happening in Inuktitut might be completely different from what's happening in Hebrew or Maltese or whatever. Because,
Language as opposed to synthesis.
yeah,
Okay.
good. All right. Thank you very much for that. Yeah, and that's obviously one of the main reasons why we're interested in this sketch project overall and why we would like people to be answering the same kinds of questions in their sketch so that exactly we can compare across different language typologies and see what's specific to a particular language and what seems to be universal across all languages, regardless of their structure or cultural background or whatever. So yes, very important points. Thank you. Okay, so in Inuktitut, at least this was not an interesting question for us, but thus we turned our attention to, well, if there isn't any ungrammatical structures particularly, then what do typical morphosyntactic structures look like? Which are questions we also mention in the manual. So a couple of questions that come up from the manual are, what are the typical morphosyntactic structures used in child-directed language? And do you observe a preference for particular constituent orders or specific tense, aspect, mood morphology or specific speech acts or whatever? So we looked at those questions. And in Inuktitut, it was particularly interesting to look at verbal inflections, as I've already mentioned. So in Inuktitut, there are about 800 possible verbal inflections. There's 10 moods and 3 numbers, singular, dual, plural, and 4 persons. And so if you combine all those and the verbal inflections also mark subject and object of the utterance and all of that together in one portmanteau utterance, one portmanteau inflection, sorry, then there's quite a lot of inflections. So we wanted to see what was happening there. And as you can see in this table, so here we have the age groups down the side, and in each age group, there's 2 children. So there's their names. Here's the number of utterances in total. And then we divided our results into verb types and verb tokens. So here we see the number of verb inflection types and tokens. Here we see the number of verb inflection types. And you see that it gradually increases, but these numbers are nowhere near 800. So children are not being exposed to the full range early on. And then the number of verbal inflection tokens, which are obviously higher. And so one thing I would like you to focus on is the group mean here, and we see that the number of verb inflection types increase from 0.09 verb inflections per utterance to 0.45 by the oldest age group. And so that means that children are being exposed to a wider variety of inflections as they get older. And then here under the verb inflection tokens, we see that the group mean goes from 0.42 verb inflection tokens per utterance to 0.71 by the oldest age. And so that means they also get more the verb inflections per utterance as they get older. And this must mean, since they have inflections on every verb, that children are hearing more verbs as they get older, or that more utterances contain a verb, and thus fewer utterances are just interactionals like hi or by, or just a noun, or just a locative adverb, or just a demonstrative, or whatever. So it's probably an indication indirectly that the language is getting more complex. Okay, so we see more types and more tokens of verbal inflections.
Shelly, may I ask another question?
Yeah.
The tokens you counted, are they of different inflections or the same repeated?
Could be the same
over?
repeated one too. So the types are all different inflections. So if they had the imperative second singular and then imperative, I don't know, first person plural, those would be two different types. But if they had 5 uses of the imperative second person singular, those would count as one type, but 5 tokens.
5 tokens.
Yeah.
Okay.
So it includes repetitions. Could include repetitions in the same utterance or different utterances, but with the same inflection. Okay?
Okay, thanks.
Yeah, good question.
Yes.
All right. Yeah, the number of verbal inflections by types and by tokens increases over time. And then we were interested in what those verbal inflections are. And so we found that the most frequent mood in child-directed language in Inuktitut was the imperative mood, accounting for about 45% of inflections, and then the indicative for about 15%. Then we found that most of the inflections were intransitive for utterances with just a subject, not a subject and object, so 75%. Then 90% of them were for singular subjects, so not dual or plural, and 60% were for second person subjects. And if you think about it, that's very consistent with the context, because mothers are typically giving commands to their kids or requesting them to do things. And so that fits with imperative and second person and singular and probably intransitive as well. So that's the general pattern that we found. And then we looked at each inflection. So this addresses your question a bit more, Sigal. We looked at each inflection. So these are all the imperative inflections that were used in all of the data. And so we listed each one, like Geet is a second person singular subject, Geetik is a second person dual subject, Li is the third person singular, etc. And then these ones here have objects as well. So Guk that we saw earlier is second person singular subject, but third person singular object. And then we showed the percentage use of each across all the different ages. This is percentage out of all the inflections, so it's not going to add up to 100 here because we just have the imperatives and not all the other ones. But anyway, this shows, I just wanted to illustrate what we've done, listing all the different inflections and then how many times they're each used. And so you see here the most common ones are Geet and Kuk. And we had seen those before in, let's see if I can get to my other screen here. Yeah. Here we had seen them before. So come here has this inflection Geet, and look at it has this inflection Guk. And those turned out to be very frequent inflections in the children. Okay, let's see if I can get back now. to know where I was there. Okay, so there they are. And so you see that at 1 year, 4 months, for example, 20% of the inflections in child-directed speech are the skeet and 27% are guk, and then occasional uses of some of the other ones. Okay. Then we turn to nominal inflections. So nominal inflections are also prolific in Inuktitut. There's about 400 of them. There's 8 different cases, and including some grammatical cases and some locative ones like locative, ablative, allative, equalis, whatever. And so 8 cases, and then the 4 persons and 3 numbers, and included in the nominal inflections are possessive, all the possessives. So that makes about 400. And again, this table is structured in the same way as the previous one. And again, you see that these numbers here for types come nowhere near 400. So children, at least in our samples, aren't being exposed to anywhere near the full system. But they are being exposed to a bunch of different inflections. And you see again here that the group mean for noun inflection types increases from 0.02 per utterance at 1 year, 4 months to 0.15 per utterance at 3 years, 4 months. And then the noun inflection tokens increases from 0.06 per utterance at 1 year, 4 months to 0.24 per utterance at 3 years, 4 months. So this means again that they're being exposed to a greater variety of inflections as they get older and a greater number of inflection tokens. And that might be, so the absolutive singular inflection is actually null, which I think is typical in many languages. And that's inflection that you'd see if people are just naming things, or if there's a singular subject of a verb or whatever. So the fact that they're seeing more tokens as they get older probably means that they're seeing more nominals that are objects, or that are plural, or whatever, or in different cases, not in the absolutive. Okay, so that is nominal inflections, and then we were interested in seeing which ones are the most frequent. And so we saw that indeed the absolutive case accounts for about 50% of the inflections. About 90% of them are singular. Possessive inflections are more frequent at 1 year, 4 months and 1 year, 10 months. So about 70% of the inflections at younger ages are possessives. And then non-possessive inflections get more frequent after 2 years. And again, we looked at the individual inflections for in a table like this. And this is just the absolutive inflections. And so we see here that these 3 are particularly frequent. This first one is the plural eat. That's not possessive, and you see that it's not used at all at 1 year, 4 months, but gets used a bit later, like 30% at 1 year, 10 months. Then the same form eat, meaning your, the second person singular possessor and singular possessee, accounts for 80% of inflections at 1 year, 4 months. And nga, the meaning his or her or its, is also pretty frequent, comes in at 1 year, 10 months, or in the child-directed speech at 1 year, 10 months. So this is just an illustration of that we looked at each of the inflections and saw when and how frequently it was used at the different ages to get a kind of general picture of what things look like. Okay, so that's all about inflections. Then another thing we looked at was subjects and objects. So we found that, so subjects and objects also in adult-directed speech are very typically omitted. because there's this rich verbal inflectional system. And so we wanted to see if that was happening in child-directed speech as well. And indeed, we found that it was the case. And so you see already by 1 year, 4 months that 96% of the subjects are omitted, and that stays fairly consistent around 90% or higher throughout every age. And you see that that's across quite a large number of verbs, so it's not a trivial coincidental finding, I think. And then object realization is somewhat more common, but also frequently omitted. So in these data, we found that the object was omitted in around 80% of utterances. And notice that for both subjects and objects, this pattern is staying consistent across the ages. It's not noticeably going up or down. So this would probably look very different than in Seagal's data. But for us, it stayed fairly consistent. And so again, this is something that's going to differ depending on the typology of the language and whatever. But for Inuktitut, we found consistent subject and object omission and this consistent difference between them, that subjects are omitted more than objects, which is also pretty typical across languages.
Shanley, did you look at two children? I wonder what the differences were between the parents of the different children.
So we did look at that.
Just one.
Yeah, the data are not in the sketch, and I don't.
Because there may be.
Yeah, there may well be differences between them. That's true, and that is something one should look at. I'm guessing, given these numbers, that there's not huge differences between the parents, and also given the typical pattern that we know from Inuktitut, but that definitely looking at how things are with the two individual children at each age is an important thing to do, because there could be differences between them. And in some of the other things we've looked at, we did see differences between the different mothers. So yeah, another good point. Yeah, there's going to be probably quite a lot of variability between the two children for each age. And that's one of the weaknesses of the sketch approach, that you're only looking at two children. So there's a limit to how generalizable the data can be. On the other hand, at least you're looking at two children, so at least you'll get something which you might not otherwise get. So, okay, so we looked at subjects and objects. This is the pattern we found. Then we looked at word order, because we thought that would be interesting. And we found that it follows the default pattern. So Inuktitut has default subject, object, verb word order, which is typical for many languages of the world. And it also has flexible word order for various information structure things. So you find all the different possible word orders. Of course, the biggest problem for looking at word order is that the subject and object, as we showed on the previous slide, are very often omitted. But anyway, our child-directed language showed no utterances with both the subject and the object. So that was interesting. In the sketch data come from a corpus that has about 60 hours of data, and there we saw a few instances of utterances that have both subject and object, but not very many, even in 60 hours. So that means that children are not getting a lot of evidence of the ordering of subject versus object, for example. But for the utterances where there was a subject, we found that 100% of times in the child-directed language, the subject came before the verb and it never appeared after the verb. In the larger set of data, we did find some instances of it appearing after the verb, but we found this very interesting here. And in the for objects, when the object appeared, it also mostly appeared before the verb, following the default word order and not that often after the verb. And this also, there was no clear, well, obviously with the subject, there was no developmental pattern. It was the same at every age. And with the object, there was also no clear developmental pattern. I'm guessing that if you compared children at 1 and 3 and then 10 and 15 or whatever, there would be a developmental pattern, but and maybe in the children themselves there is, so that would be interesting to compare across child-directed language and child language. But anyway, here we didn't see anything. And yeah, I found it very interesting given the flexibility in word order that we saw pretty much only use of the default word order here. Okay, so that's all that we looked at for the typical morphosyntactic patterns. These are things we found interesting for Inuktitut. Depending on the typology of the language you're looking at, you may find other things interesting. And so the sketch approach is on purpose very flexible so that you can pick the things that are going to make sense and be interesting for your language. Okay, then the final thing we looked at was repetitions and variations. So some of the questions we ask in the manual include, do you see exact repetitions? Do you see formulaic utterances? Do you see variation sets? How common are they? What are their functions? Who uses them? Do you see any age-related differences? And so I'm not quite sure why, but we didn't focus very much on this section in Inuktitut, I think because we put so much focus on the typical patterns. Anyway, we did see variation sets. We saw them, we focused only on variation sets. We didn't look at general repetition or formulaic utterances. We saw variation sets at every age. And so variation sets are, as we say here, sequences of utterances that have lexical overlap, but not 100%. And the part that's different typically highlights a different word or a different morpheme, and the idea is that it helps that adults use it to help children segment the word or the morpheme or whatever. So here's a couple of examples from Inuktitut. In this first one, we see mani amalekli, let it be carried on your back here, and then ati amalerit, come on, carry it on your back. And so we see the same verb root, amak, to carry on your back, and the same morpheme, politeness morpheme, lit, that's used before an imperative, but then two different imperative morphemes, li and git. And so the idea here is that this would help the child to segment the different imperative morphemes because they see that the beginning is the same, but the ending is different. That ending must mean something different. And then here is a second example where the child uses, where the mother uses two different verbs with the same inflection. So the mother says palaktok, she tripped, and ikayotok, she fell. I think referring to the same instance, but palak and ikayok are different verbs, even though tuk, which is phonologically represented as, is the same ending. And so the idea is that that would help the child segment, this palak and ikayok, iukak, sorry, must be separate things. And indeed, the child then, in the course of conversation, says palak, picking out one of those verb roots, which itself as an utterance would not be grammatical in Inuktitut, it would need an inflection, but this utterance shows that she's segmented that as a morpheme. And so then it's interesting to look at variation sets and see if they exist in your language and how they're used, how frequently they're used, and any evidence that the use of variation sets, like in this case here, seems to be helping children segment morphemes. Okay, so those are the things that we looked at in Inuktitut. So I'll just come back to this slide here in general. We covered differences in mean length of utterance, and we looked at both utterance and words. Then any morphosyntactic differences, and we also looked at typical morphosyntactic patterns in child-directed language, and then repetitions and variations. And for whatever reason, we expanded mostly on this question 2 and not at all really on question 3, but depending on what's happening in your data, what you're interested in, and what makes sense for your language, then you should focus on what you would like to. Okay, so now we have some time for questions and discussion, and I wish you all good luck in writing up the morphosyntax section for child-directed language. And I'm going to stop the slide share now and have you. Okay, let me see if I can come back to Zoom. No. Okay. Stop share there. Okay. Cool. All right. So, questions, comments?
I wanted to suggest. I wanted to suggest another measure, maybe.
Yeah.
If you in some of the work that I've done, we looked at the syntagmatic as opposed to paradigmatic development. Or so syntagmatic means that you have development in different verbs, and paradigmatic is particular verb. So this can also give you some kind of idea of whether the parents develop or change their use of inflection over time when they speak to their children, whether they extend the inflectional paradigm for particular verbs over time.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I don't know if everyone heard that quite well. Sigal is suggesting that we look at syntagmatic as opposed, or that one could look either at syntagmatic or paradigmatic patterns, either focusing on the different verbs used or different inflections used, or focusing in on one verb and then all the inflections that are used with that verb. So we did more the former, and in Hebrew they've done the latter, which also would be a very interesting way to approach things. I totally agree. Yeah.
And another measure that was developed by the Dressler group in Vienna, the MSP, mean size paradigm, which can also be used to measure the development of the inflectional paradigm, both in CS, Arish Santos, and the people on this measure, called the mean size paradigm, MSP.
What's it called?
Mean size paradigm, MSP.
Mean size paradigm. Okay. All right.
Yes, MSP.
Okay, in the work of the Dressler group. Okay, I'm not familiar with that, but
yes,
that sounds very interesting.
Santos et al. From 2011.
Yeah. Cool. Okay, thank you very much. Those are great ideas. Rowena, it looked like you were going to say something.
Yes, thank you so much for the presentation. I have a rather specific question about the type and token ratio, if that's fine. So in Tagalog, there are prefixes that seem to have different functions. So it's the same, let's say, ma prefix. So some grammarians have said this is the same. So they have thought of like a formulation that can encompass the different meanings, so to say. So this ma prefix seems to come before adjectives, but also before verbs. So it does look different. And some grammarians say they are just homophonous. So they're different things but sound the same. And now I'm wondering if we should calculate them separately for the type token ratio, for example. Just thinking, of course, of do the children also know that they're different anyway? So I'm quite curious about your thoughts on this.
Yeah, that's a very interesting question. And yeah, I think that comes up over and over. Um, my usual answer to questions like this is that I would do it both ways and see what
Okay.
happens. That I would definitely code or annotate these things in a way that you could separate them if you wanted to. So let's say right now you think they're the same thing, but maybe later in your analyses you realize, oh my goodness, children don't really realize they're the same thing, or I want to really focus on that. I mean, that could be a very interesting, like, master's thesis or something, for example, to take all instances and see if there's any evidence you can find that children are treating them differently or that it changes over time. Or, I mean, it'd be probably intricate to do, and I'm not sure the sketch data would really be enough, but since you have quite a lot more data than just the sketch data, then you might have enough data. So I guess that's what I always recommend, to at least within the annotation system have the possibility that you could separate them and then see, because we don't really know, right? That's one of the things we're trying to find out, how quickly, like, are children orienting simply to the phonological string, or how quickly are they integrating syntactic or semantic or whatever components into the meanings of those? And even if they are those things noticeably different? So I don't know. It sounds like some Tagalog linguists have found a way to make them the same thing,
Yes.
whereas others not. So, and I don't know, for adult native speakers, are they perceived as different? Does it matter if they're perceived as different? Would it?
So it's as if they're categorized into different things already. One becomes part of like adjectives, and the others as verbs that are not voluntarily, or like not volitionally done. So
Mhm.
they do seem for a non-linguist that they're just different things, but they both start with ma, something like this. And it is indeed an interesting question for me when children learn these
Yeah,
two different mass in that case, but I think it makes sense to have a way to separately count them and just combine them
yeah,
for when it's needed, but to find a way to separate them.
yeah.
And just another question about the variation sets. How many, maybe I just missed this, but how many conversational turns are we talking about when we say these? This is still from the same set, so to
Yeah.
say.
So that's a very good question, and there's different ways of approaching this in the literature. We used, so the original work on this is from Kuntai and Slobin, and then Waterfall also did quite an extensive work on variation sets. And so we used a definition from there that had, I think, the maximum of 2 utterances between the 2 instances. I think Kuntai and Sloban also require that the context be the same, that the communicative intent is the same. So they make a difference between, for example, I don't know, pick up your book, get that book now, something like that, versus pick up your book, pick up your doll or whatever, or is daddy coming home from work? Is mommy coming home from work? They would call those, what did I call them? Functional variation or something. And the other one's a variation set. Some, I don't know, there's different terms. Anyway, so more like the slot and filling the slot idea from like Liebman, Tomasello, etc. So, okay, I guess the summary is there's different ways of looking at this in the literature, and you just need to pick a definition that makes sense from you. But the one that we oriented to was the Kuntayan slope and waterfall group.
Thank you.
Does that help? What have you been doing in your data?
We haven't really looked at variation sets yet. What we have just done would be mostly looking at, so I guess it's almost like the paradigmatic one that Sigal was mentioning. So for a verb, what were the different inflections that were used in the same recording for this child, for example? But we haven't looked at the context, timestamps, just in this 1 hour of recording, what different uses of the same verb did the child hear? So, yeah.
I think people with larger data sets use computational tools to determine variation sets, and then they define like can't be more than 2 utterances apart and needs to have this amount of overlap or whatever. We didn't have the computational tools and also had a small enough data set that we just decided to do it by hand. Is that the right thing or not? I don't know.
Thank you.
Yeah. Okay, good. Other questions, comments, people's own experience? Or other things people would recommend, Miss?
Sorry, there we go. I was just, since nobody else was going to say anything, I just wanted to comment on the thing you mentioned, Rowena, about the prefix in Tagalog, because I don't know anything about Tagalog, but it sounded to me like you said there are clear distributional differences between and then it's the question of word classes in Tagalog and how clear are they, but it could sound like a case of what the structuralists sometimes, the trap that they sometimes fall into with the Gesamtbedeutung, which, a good example of this is that in some cases, structuralists have tried to argue that the English S suffix is like the plural suffix in the third person singular macaron verbs, and there is another one that I forgot, that they are...
The possessive.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, that they are the same, even though, well, yeah, on this like very abstract level, and this it is clearly not as clear in Tagalog, but to me, at least when you presented it, like the one is on adjectives and the other is on verbs, it sounded like it could be the case of, well, some structuralist has looked at Tagalog and said, well, this is the same thing, and we can make this abstract category that we can fit it into, and that's not always the best way to go. But I'm not saying that you shouldn't go there because you might have good reasons, but I just think that you should think about it before you go there.
Yeah, thank you so much, Mats. It felt like that indeed, that they're saying, okay, the verb is like an adjective. That's not really a verb. It gives you I cannot explain it properly, but it's as if the ma gives you this property. So even if it sounds like a verb to us, it can be described like an adjective. But indeed, some colleagues here at SAS were working on the S sounds in English, so that they are separate, so that they might be homophonous, but they were actually checking, could there be any other differences in them in terms of length, actually. So they're really checking recordings and see, are there differences in these S uses, which made us think we should probably do the same with these ma. If there's any other cue for a child that this is different, maybe there could be something in duration, maybe not, but yeah, we plan to use the same data that we have that we use for the sketch for this kind of testing. So we have to mark all the mass in the data set practically, well, a smaller subset, and then see if there's any durational difference. Thanks a lot.
It would be very interesting. I just read an article that is big in the news at the moment, also research coming out of Doreko from SAS, showing that the first consonant in a word is like 30 milliseconds longer than that same consonant in other places in the word, and that could be a key that kids use for segmentation. Well, I don't think it goes as far as saying that, but I'm going that far as saying that.
Exactly.
30 milliseconds is very short, and you need fancy equipment to measure that, whatever. But yeah, there could be something like that.
Yeah, this is really the Dorico corpus that I was talking about with the length as well. And when they talked about this study with the lengthening of the first one, I immediately thought as well of segmentation. Like, oh,
Yeah,
this would
yeah.
be what this is a cue for a child. Although the researcher I talked to was a bit hesitant to go that further of, okay, I'm not yet saying this can be used, but they do
I-
see that it's longer.
Yeah, it's the first thing I thought of because
Yeah.
they also show that, for example, if you have they didn't show, but the literature has shown that if you have something like night rates, like the rate you pay at night, versus nitrates, the
Yeah.
chemical, that t in the middle is pronounced longer or shorter, and that is a segmentation cue. So why wouldn't 30 milliseconds at the beginning of the word also be a segmentation cue?
Yeah.
So
So
totally.
the 30 milliseconds difference, was that found in English or?
No, across a database of
Oh,
how many languages are in
I
Dorico?
don't remember, but a lot.
Something like
wow.
50 languages of all continents and many different language families.
But what I know is that I think these are not child-directed speech, so
No.
maybe it might even be more pronounced in child-directed speech, for
Yeah,
example.
maybe, yeah. That would be super interesting to look at, and maybe something that we could look at with the sketch data once we have enough of it collected with high enough audio quality. That's super interesting. Cool. Anyway.
And the Reco team, I just wanted to add that they have like an automated way of parsing the audio. So then it's marked where the words are, where the phonemes are, but then we would need manual adjustments to make it better if this audio is not so good. But at least there's somehow help from the automated tools.
Yeah. All right. So we end with something about phonology. But anyway, I see that our hour is finished, so I think we will stop here. The next meeting focuses on, so for child-directed language, we put morphology and syntax together. I think partly because there's not so much research on morphosyntax and child-directed language. Although in the Inuktitut sketch, we actually wrote them up separately. But anyway, next, for the child language, we will now have one session on morphology, which is next month on the 11th and 12th of March, and then one session on syntax, which will be whatever the second Wednesday in April is. So for us in Europe, it'll be on the 12th of March. I assume most of you are in Europe. So 1 month from today. And morphology and child language. And so we will see you there. And until then, have a great week. Okay, bye-bye.